Haus am Dom. Der Podcast.
Liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich zu unserer Live-Podcast-Aufnahme hier im Haus am Dom in Frankfurt. Mein Name ist Johannes Lorenz und ich mache einen Podcast zusammen mit
Helge Bezold von der Evangelischen Akademie, direkt gegenüber.
Wir haben uns vor einiger Zeit zusammengesetzt und überlegt, wir könnten doch mal englischsprachige, also internationale Theologinnen und Theologen einladen, um so ein bisschen den Horizont zu erweitern und nach draußen zu gucken. Und der Helge ist auf ein Buch gestoßen von einem englischen Theologen, anglikanischen Theologen Graham Tomlin. Und der hat ein Buch geschrieben mit dem Titel Sei du selbst und andere schlechte Ideen. Und wir fanden diesen Titel so genial, dass wir gesagt haben, wir müssen Graham Tomlin einfach mal einladen und mit ihm einen kleinen Talk machen.
Ja, und das haben wir heute gemacht. Das Buch greift vielleicht das Thema Social Media als Eröffnungspunkt auf, um die Frage nach Selbstoptimierung, die Frage nach, wie man eigentlich sich selbst so gern haben kann, ohne sich gleich zu verleugnen und wie christliche Selbstliebe funktioniert in unseren Zeiten. Und es war ein sehr persönliches Gespräch, es war ein ehrliches Gespräch und ein sehr tiefgründiges Gespräch, das würde ich sagen.
Ja, fand ich auch. Und wir würden uns freuen, wenn es Ihnen auch gefällt, und schreiben Sie uns gerne, wenn es Ihnen gefallen hat oder auch nicht. Und wir freuen uns schon auf das nächste Experiment und ja, wünschen viel Vergnügen beim Anhören.
Viel Spaß mit Graham Tomlin.
Dear guests, a very warm welcome to our first joint podcast conversation. My name is Johannes Lorenz and I work as a program director at the Catholic Academy.
And I'm Helge Bezold from the Protestant Academy. We are neighbors in Frankfurt, as I just mentioned, just 50 meters across. Some time ago, the two of us decided that we would like to take an occasional look at international theology and literature together. And about half a year ago, the theological publishing house Zurich published the German translation of a fascinating book, Why Being Yourself is a Bad Idea. It was written by the former Anglican bishop, author, and doctor of theology Graham Tomlin, and first published in 2020, I think. Hello, Mr. Tomlin.
Hello, very good to see you, and very glad to be part of this conversation.
We found the title of your book so wonderfully paradoxical, and we immediately thought we'd love to invite Graham Tomlin to talk to us and explain our German audience why being yourself might actually be a bad idea.
So we are very happy that he's joining us this evening from England. Mr. Tomlin, thanks for being with us. And we'd like to talk with you about your book, of course, but also get to know you as a person a little better. And after our short podcast talk, there will be an opportunity for the audience here in the room to ask questions. As you, dear audience, probably hear, our conversation will be in English. And if anyone would prefer to ask a question in German afterwards, that's perfectly fine. We're happy to translate. I'm sure we'll manage just fine together. So then, let's start. We'd love to get to know you a little better first, Mr. Tomlin, not just as an author and theologian, but as a person. Let's imagine someone stops you on the street and asks, Mr. Tomlin, who are you? How would you describe yourself?
I would say I'm a Christian, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, and I'm a beloved child of God. That's how I would describe myself. Yeah.
That is 4 things to say. Congratulations about these. That is great. We just mentioned you have been a bishop, and you write about being yourself is a bad idea. And I would like to know, in how far was being a bishop a bad idea?
Being a bishop was a good idea on the whole. I enjoyed being a bishop. It was a very privileged position to be in, to oversee a whole number of churches and to help to encourage those churches and to enable them to function as well as they can. So I really enjoyed the task of being a bishop. I got very interested in the question of how the church communicates its message in public. And so I found myself getting more and more interested in that question, which led to what I do now, which is that 3 years ago, I left my regular job as a bishop to start a new initiative here in England called the Centre for Cultural Witness, which has at its heart a website called seenandunseen.com, which is trying to articulate a kind of Christian commentary on what's going on in our world today. So yeah, being a bishop was a good job to do. But I've gone on to do something else a little bit since then.
That was a good idea. Now you have an even better one.
Even better, exactly.
Helge already mentioned that your book has a very paradoxical title. And we wondered what was the reason you wrote such a book? What motivated you to think, well, I think I have to write a book which sounds a bit contra-cultural?
Yeah. Well, I can remember the time when I began thinking about the idea of writing the book. I remember my daughter had a baby, and she had the baby baptized, and I remember I baptized the child myself, and I remember after the baptism having a conversation with some of my daughter's friends, and they were friends of hers from her university days, and many of them didn't have a faith in any way at all. They were secular people, and they had been invited because they were friends of my daughter, and they found this whole ceremony of baptism very strange. You know, what were you doing to this child? You know, splashing water all over him. And we found ourselves talking about faith afterwards, and it struck me that for them, they couldn't really understand this Christian faith that was important to me, important to my daughter, my family. But they were not. But it wasn't that they were unspiritual people. They weren't materialistic. They weren't, bad people. They were very good people. They wanted to get the most out of life. They wanted to experience as much as they could. They liked travel. They did mindfulness. They were kind of spiritually minded. And I began to think, we had a conversation where I was kind of struggling to explain what Christian faith really means and what it could mean for someone like that. And I went away from the conversation thinking, I would love to try to write something for that kind of person, for the person who is not necessarily already a Christian, or maybe they have a dormant Christian faith, but it's not really a live Christian faith. How would I explain Christian faith to them? And I began to think, what's the way in? What's the way in to opening up the conversation? And I suppose I began to recognize how much we talk about ourselves in contemporary culture. You know, we say, we have to believe in ourselves. We give ourselves, believe in yourself, or love yourself, or respect yourself, or express yourself, or be yourself. We talk about that all the time. And then when I turn to the gospel, I kind of read Jesus' advice, which is to deny yourself, which sounds so countercultural to all our emphasis upon loving ourselves and expressing ourselves and so on. So, and it struck me that was maybe a way into thinking about what Christian faith offered to our culture, by starting from that place, that maybe the number one kind of moral command of contemporary life, to be yourself. Maybe that's the kind of key to getting into helping to understand why Christian faith offers you something different from that.
That is very interesting, and I would love to hear how, whether it was possible to convince him or the family about this idea, or whether it needed an entire book, and how they liked the book. But we can move to that later on. Maybe we start off with something that at least caught my eye when I heard and read about your book, and that is the idea of social media as a big part of this culture you're facing and dealing with. And in your book, you write that you see many people idealizing themselves mostly on social media, and you speak of a certain culture of doing that. And then this culture also implies that we do not speak openly about our misery and try to maybe hide our darker sides. And I have to say that I'm not fully convinced that social media is a mere narcissist disaster in that sense. At least in my algorithm, I see many young people making fun of themselves, speaking open about their imperfection, and that it might be even healthy to do so. So I would just like to know, what is your take on social media, and what is the foundation of your perspective on that?
I mean, I suppose I think that the social media, I mean, you think of a smartphone, I think of it as like a kind of mirror to the soul. Because, of course, when you think of social media, you think of the way algorithms work, the way that the whole kind of technique of social media works is that the more when you go on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever else it is, it kind of recognizes, it works out who you are, what age group you are, what gender you are, what background you're from, and it works out what you like. So, if you spend more time on one particular kind of video, it'll register that you like that kind of thing. If you kind of go through a video quite quickly, you realize it doesn't. I remember when I first went on TikTok, I thought, oh, I'd better find out what TikTok is like. And I went on thinking, I'm not going to like anything. I'm not going to follow anyone. I'm just going to observe. And to my amazement, within a few days, it started sending me videos of things that I was quite interested in. It sent me interested in videos of football or cricket or mountains or things that I was quite interested in. And it was uncanny the way it had worked out exactly who I was. And it sent me stuff that I was quite interested in. And we know how social media works like a kind of echo chamber, where it tends to work out what you think, and it sends you more of that stuff. So in other words, what you do when you look into a smartphone is you are looking into a mirror of your soul, for better or worse. It tends to confirm us in who we are. It sort of gives up, and it doesn't have any great sort of moral campaign to change you into something else. It simply gives you a mirror into your soul. So there's a sense in which social media, and some of that's not bad, because there are some parts of our lives that are actually good. We have particular likes and dislikes, and it will send us things that we do like. But there are also aspects of ourselves and our souls which have a slightly darker side to them. And the problem, of course, is that social media doesn't really make any distinction between those two things, and it will send us things which will confirm our worst fears or anxieties or prejudices or desires. And therefore, that's the sense in which I think the kind of social media is a bit of a mirror into the soul. And so I think that's a large part of why social media is built around a sense of confirming ourselves, reflecting ourselves back to ourselves. It's a kind of sort of the image of Narcissus looking into the pool and drowning in self-love. There's a little bit of that that goes on in social media, I think.
So it's almost too harmonizing in a sense, or too like emphasizing your best, being too, how to say that, like it's too less conflicted in that sense.
Yeah. And there is an element of, and even as you say, you do find people, talking openly about their mistakes or their struggles. But certainly for all of us, I think there are things we would say and things we wouldn't say on social media. There are sides to our lives that we would be very reluctant to go on social media, even if, and because sometimes expressing a bit of vulnerability is not a bad thing, can be quite a good thing, can bring out people's sympathy. And I know people who almost make a kind of living on social media by expressing vulnerability, because it's their way of getting affirmation. And I kind of sometimes think, is that healthy? But I think for everybody, there's a part of social media that you won't let anyone else see, because they are the darker sides of your heart, and we're not always very honest about those things.
So let's probably do our first deep dive, Mr. Tomlin. You spent quite a lot of time in your book reflecting on the question whether God really exists. That seems to be a very important theme for your argumentation in the book. Why do you think the existence of God, and especially of the Christian God in itself, is such a key part of your argument?
Well, I often go back to the argument of the great St. Augustine, who, of course, is common to both Protestant and Catholic Christianity. And in his great work, The City of God, he kind of sets up this idea that there are two cities, the city of God and the earthly city. And the difference between them is they are ordered around different loves. So the earthly city is ordered around the love of self. The city of God is ordered around love of God. And it's quite a stark sort of division. And his thing is, we either love God or we love ourselves. And that for him, the Christian path is the gradual process of learning to fall in love with God, to fall in love with something outside yourself, something that is beauty and truth and wonder and goodness. And that's for him what God is. And I suppose the reason why I go quite early in the book into this question of, is there a God beyond it, is because I do think ever since Western culture began to move away from a kind of general belief in God and a sense that there was a God, and particularly the Christian God, out there as something transcendent, or someone transcendent, something beyond ourselves. Once you rule out that sort of sacred canopy, that kind of transcendent realm, all you're left is with the immanent and not the transcendent. All you're left with is the world in which we ourselves can live. And it's as if when you remove God from the picture, all that you're left with is yourself and other selves. And so it seems to me the first step in learning to decenter your world around yourself is to realize that there is something beyond you. And that's not just other selves. There is something beyond this world, something that you cannot see, something that is as the source of everything good that you know in the world, everything that is beautiful and true and wonderful. And it comes from somewhere, and it comes not from somewhere, it comes from someone. And it's beginning to discover that person that you then begin to decenter yourself. Because I suppose I think, which goes back to my kind of analysis of where we are as a culture. And I think I would describe ourselves as a culture as a culture turned in upon itself. We are fascinated with ourselves, and that's something there's nothing wrong with that. If there's that sense of our contemporary advice to be yourself, express yourself, turns you in upon yourself to examine who am I, what are my desires, whereas actually the reality is, and I suppose that this is the heart of the Christian claim, I think, is that what we need is not so much to be turned in upon ourselves, to be turned outwards towards God and towards our neighbor. And in fact, that is the route to true happiness, rather than the kind of turn inward, which is so common in contemporary life.
The very famous philosopher Aristotle once said, if you want to search happiness, just look for something that makes you happy, not look into yourself and think about what makes you happy. Could that be an argument which you could agree with?
Yeah, I think there's something. I mean, I think I mentioned in the book that both Aristotle and Plato, they begin theology with the experience of wonder. In other words, you look outside yourself and you realize there's something that is just amazing. It's wonderful, and and there's something about those moments when you are almost not aware of yourself, because you wake up in the morning and you see an amazing sunrise, or you go to a concert and you hear some music which is just perfect, or you see a sporting event and some miraculous bit of sporting ability, or you fall in love, or whatever it might be. And in those moments, you're not aware of yourself. You're just aware of the wonder of this thing outside yourself. And those moments seem to me a clue to where true happiness is to be found. It's almost like when you lose that rather crippling self-awareness and actually become absorbed in something that is beautiful and wonderful outside yourself. And then I suppose I would want to go beyond that and say, well, where do those things come from? And they come from the source of all truth and beauty, which is God. Now, in some ways, that's an idea which I think Aristotle and Plato would have both recognized. And in some ways, Christianity was born in that world. I think it has probably more in common with Plato than it does with Aristotle, but that's a whole other question. But I think that recognition that that true happiness and wisdom is found by going outside yourself, not by turning in towards yourself, is, I think, a really important insight, which is not just Christian. It's shared by other faiths and other philosophies as well. But there's more to be said about that than from the Christian perspective. But I think that is a true insight to begin with.
I'm not trying to play the Protestant here, but when I hear the idea of amazement and wonder, I always think of Schleiermacher's idea of a sense for infinity or a feeling of infinity. But there's quite a big step from, I guess this is also a more cultural form of theology that many people have nowadays, that, there is something, there is some feeling of nature and wonder about these things, about love. How do you translate this kind of weight to a personal God, a God that reveals himself in Jesus Christ? What is your take on how to make this God personal?
Yeah, I think, and I suppose what I try to do in the book, and then there's a chapter early on where I kind of raise the question of, well, do we believe in a God or not? And what reason might there for believing there is a God? And I'm a little bit skeptical about some of the arguments for the existence of God. They don't seem to work terribly well to me. The one that does make some sense to me is the idea that, back to this idea of wonder, because wonder, when you wonder at something, what you're wondering about, what that experience of wonder is the realization that the thing you're looking at might not have existed. I remember when we had our first child, I was just amazed to look into the face of this little baby, and it was a sense of wonder because we might not have been able to have children. He might have been different. He might have died in childbirth. There's a sense that he's contingent, to use the technical term. And it's that sense that, that why is there something rather than nothing? And that seems to be the biggest clue to get into to realizing that what we have, and it helps you begin to realize, who God is. God is the one thing within the universe which is not contingent but necessary. But then that leads to the question, well, if that's true, you might believe in a God, some kind of spiritual presence out there, something from which the world came. And of course, many people do believe, and most people in the world believe in God. I then I suppose begin to think the natural question is, well, what is this God like? If there is such a being as God, if there is some kind of spiritual intelligence out there, can we say anything more about this God? And that's where I turn to the very common human experience of our need for love, because it seems to be something universal about us human beings, that we thrive when we are loved and we shrivel when we are unloved. And somehow a mature human being, we can recognize this, is someone who has learned the capacity to love someone else and to be loved by them. Now, if that's a universal human experience, is that a clue to the nature of this God we're talking about? And if it is, then where do we find a picture of a God who is love? Now, out of all the world faiths, out of all the world philosophies, there's only one that I know of that has at its very heart this statement that God is love. Not just that God loves as one of a number of different things that he does, but that God is love. And that is, of course, Christian faith. And that the reason why Christian faith shows that God is love, because it has this message of incarnation. It has this message of God himself coming into human flesh out of love for the human race, going to the point of death and crucifixion, and then demonstrating that death is not, love conquers death in the end. And so that, I think, leads you towards, if you like, if there is a God, what's he like? Well, maybe love is the beginnings of a clue to that. And if we're talking about love as the heart of God, then it's Christian faith that draws your attention, because it has at its heart this image of Jesus Christ as the love of God made into human flesh.
Mr. Tomlin, you almost answered that question already, but I'd like to point it out again, because Christians often say that every person is a unique image of God, someone with an irreplaceable self. And And I think my experience is that there are many Christian spiritual movements today that encourage people to discover or develop that unique self. Can you understand that impulse, or would you say that's already moving in a direction that could get wrong?
Yeah, as you're absolutely right, Johannes, that many Christians emphasize today, we are made in the image of God, and that's what makes us unique. And that's true. Although I sometimes worry about the way we say that. It implies a kind of what matters about us is our own individual uniqueness. Whereas it seems to me that what really matters about us, what really matters about me is not what makes me different from you. It's actually what makes me the same as you. In other words, that you and I are both objects of divine love. And that's actually what it means to be in the image of God. It means to be someone who is loved by God in relation to God. And sometimes we talk about the image of God as if it's an individual thing, or something that somebody possesses. I possess my own version of the image of God. Whereas I think the image of God says something about that I am loved by God, and that I am made in the image of a God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who is relational in his own being. And so you can't separate out image of God from relationship. And again, once you start saying that, if I'm made in the image of a God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, if being made in the image of God means that I am loved by God, I am the object of divine love, that means that the key thing is not my own individual personality, but it's recognizing that I am loved by God, that I am called to love my neighbor. That's what it means to be in the image of God. It's a relational thing, not an individual thing. And so I think that's the kind of one slight concern I have about the way we talk about being made in the image of God. I want to say that has to be relational at its core, relationship to God, relationship to others. Because at the heart of the teaching of Jesus is that, he says, what is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, your mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. That's the absolute heart of Christian faith. And that's what it means to be in the image of God, I think.
And how would you deal with talkings like you have to emphasize your talents, as there are Bible stories that says you don't have to put your talents under the table, you have to emphasize them. Would you say that's something separate to individuality?
I mean, there clearly are particular talents, skills that each one of us have that are different, and we clearly need to discover what those are and to express them. But I think alongside the parable of the talents in the Gospels, you put the teaching in the epistles of the New Testament about the spiritual gifts. And it seems to be clear that when St. Paul talks about spiritual gifts, he talks about them not as primarily given for the individual. They're given for the building up of the body. They're given for the building of community. So whatever those talents and gifts may be that I have, they're not just given for me to enjoy or to express my own individuality. They're given so that I might build community around me, that I might use those talents to build the neighborhood that I live in, the family that I'm part of, the church that I belong to, the city, the nation that I'm part of. Now, they are kind of communally given. They're given for the one, to the one person, for the sake of the whole.
So they're given by the one, like basically lent for a certain lifetime, not an achievement, you would say.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Mm. I was also fascinated by the idea of self-love in your book. You have this very like a short chapter, a short passage on self-love, and you speak about ways to love oneself. And I was surprised that you end this chapter, I don't know if this was an intention of yours, but you end this chapter with a notion about death and the idea of how to prepare oneself to die in hope. You mentioned that you have had classes for elderly people to prepare them to die in hope. And I would like to know how far is the reality of death and the hope for resurrection something that might help us to love ourselves or get rid of the idea? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. There is a proper love of self. when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, what he implies is that, well, we do love ourselves. And I think the way I understand that is that to love myself is to make sure that I have the basics that I need for life, that I have food, that I have shelter, that I have friends, I have companionship, I have community, I have enough money to get by. To love yourself is to look after yourself. So it's not wrong to, go to the gym and get fit and to look after your health and to earn a living for yourself and others. But if I'm to love my neighbor as myself, that means that I'm to be as concerned that my neighbor has those things as I am that I have them. So rather than focusing all my attention on, have I got enough money? Is my health okay? Have I got the friends I need? Have I got the community, the job? I'm also to think of my neighbor. Have they got the food they need? Have they got the enough income to make their life work? And that's what loving your neighbor as yourself means. If you like, what Jesus says is we kind of know how to love ourselves most of the time. Now, I know some people struggle to love themselves, and that's a strange thing about human life. But the most of us know roughly how to look after ourselves if we can. But it shouldn't stop there. It has to go beyond that to kind of think, well, if I'm looking after myself to have the basics, I need to let other people have to ensure to give my time and attention to make sure my neighbor has those things too. And even to the point where, and this is where it comes back again to Jesus, because for him to enable the human race to have freedom, liberation, forgiveness, grace, it cost him his life. And sometimes love does cost that. Love is not an easy thing. It's something that is only demonstrated in self-sacrifice. That's how you know when someone loves you, when they're willing to sacrifice something for you. If they say, I love you, but they're really not willing to give up anything to win your friendship or to for your sake, where you begin to wonder whether they really do love you at all. And so love and self-sacrifice are all bound up together. And that, on occasion, does lead to suffering and in the case of Jesus Christ, to death, and for those of the Christian martyrs as well. So, yeah, there is a connection, I think, between love, self-love and death. Yeah.
As you just said, self-sacrifice, I wondered, some people might argue that Christianity hasn't always had an easy relationship with the self, that for centuries it even encouraged self-denial or self-hatred. Could today's fascination with the self be in a way a cultural reaction on this kind of self-hatred, which probably sometimes had been very unhealthy, very vulnerable to the self as well?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I recently, the book I've just written, it was published earlier this year, is a biography of the great French scientist, philosopher, theologian Blaise Pascal. And one of the striking things about Pascal's language is he talks about self-hatred. He talks about annihilating the self. He says how important it is to learn to hate yourself. And that's really stark language for us. We find that really difficult. In fact, in the biography, I've got a whole chapter on that language of self-hatred because it's so countercultural for us. And I try to get at what he means by it. And I think he was somebody who was profoundly influenced by St. Augustine, and this sense that you either love God or you love yourself. And the more you love yourself, the less likely you are to love God. And the more you love God, the less focused you are upon yourself. And so I think what he means by it, and at its best, what the Christian tradition means by that kind of language is learning to lose this obsession with ourselves, to learn almost to forget ourselves, to be absorbed by this contemplation of what is good and true and beautiful and the source of all those things in God, the God of Jesus Christ. And that's why Pascal can talk about it in these very almost kind of aggressive, quite stark terms about the sort of hatred of the self. You have to kind of And in a way, the New Testament does it as well. St. Paul talks about, dying, your old self dying and your new self being born. And I think that's really, that's the other aspect of what the Christian tradition means by it. It means that if you are a Christian, there are these two selves living inside yourself, the old self and the new self. And I think what that means is there's that old self that always wants to be at the center of attention, always wants everybody else to think I'm wonderful, that gets upset when I don't get what I want. And it kind of says that I have to be quite ruthless with that self and allow the new self to be born, a self that is capable of reaching out from myself in love for other people and for God. Now, you're absolutely right. Sometimes that self-hatred can become a quite crippling thing. And I think it becomes crippling when it's not associated with love for God as its opposite. If all you have is self-hatred, then that's not a good thing. All you end up is being, again, it's another form of self-obsession. In some ways, in order, too much self-love or too much self-hatred, it kind of ends up being the same thing. We're just still obsessed with ourselves. The point being is we learn this fascination with the source of all truth and goodness and beauty, which is God himself.
That's a great observation. And I'd like to move a bit away from our very, I guess, theological depth and maybe move on towards something that I'm also very interested in, and that's politics. And most part of my job is political, and I always wonder how can theology and how can these insights shed light on what is happening in our societies, especially Western societies. We struggle with polarization, we struggle with authoritarianism, we struggle with climate change and the denial of climate change. How do you think your work or your idea of Christian faith can I don't know, make an impact in our societies again, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think a number of things to say about that. I mean, I think number one, the Christian faith is a kind of it's a way of learning to lose our obsession with ourselves and instead to become people capable of reaching out and loving our neighbor, and even beyond our neighbor, loving our enemy. And now that seems to be the most radical thing that Jesus ever taught, that you don't hate your enemy. You don't even don't just tolerate your enemy. You don't ignore your enemy, but you actively love your enemy. And I suppose I think if you could imagine a society where people had learnt to love their enemies, that would not be a bad place to live. And so in terms of a vision for what kind of political system we are seeking to build, that picture of a system where and it seems to be part of our problem with our contemporary politics is that obsessive individualism, which is all about individual rights, individual choice. We maximize, the individual, the autonomous individual on their own, free to do what they want as long as then they don't hurt anybody else. And it's a vision that's common to both left and right, conservative and progressive in politics. And I think what Christian faith offers us is a very different vision of the way society works, which is not focused on the autonomous individual. It isn't focused upon independence, but actually on dependence, because the reality is we are dependent on each other. That's how politics work. It's the polis, the city, where we learn how dependent we are on other people. I'm dependent right now on the people who made my computer or who are going to make the internet work right now that enables me to talk to you. I'm dependent upon you because we're having this conversation. I'm dependent upon the people who made the food that I've just eaten for my dinner. All the time we're dependent on each other. And it seems to me a society which emphasizes that interdependence and cultivates the kind of institutions that build local community at the kind of local level, I think is a much more powerful vision than either the very individualism that says there's nothing between the state and the individual. Something that I think Catholic social teaching talks about quite a lot. That's that idea of local institutions, churches, trade unions, local groups, where people learn to encounter one another and learn to love one another at that local level. So that's one of the things I think that the Christian vision can bring to our kind of politics today.
There were quite a lot of questions from our audience, which also implies that their English is pretty good because they could all follow. That is very nice to hear, so that they could follow our conversation. We would like to start with a question on the German title of your book. I have no idea in how many languages your book have been translated, and if you were aware of all the titles in their native context, but the German title, literally translated, would be Yourself, ! And other bad ideas. And one member of our audience asked, what might other bad ideas be from your point of view?
Yeah, well, the English title is Why Being Yourself is a Bad Idea and Other Countercultural Notions. And I think the translators tried to find a way of saying that in German that was a bit more idiomatic for Germans. And I suppose I'm just trying to see how they've translated the chapter titles. I suppose what it's trying to do, I mean, each chapter tries to have something arresting which draws the attention. So
they did that. Why evil exists and we can't explain, or something like that.
Yeah. So why praying is dangerous. Why evil exists and it can't be explained. Why love is and isn't all you need. So I suppose the implication is that some of those bad ideas are that you think, well, love is all you need. Well, in one sense, that's a bad idea if it is just, finding the one person to love is going to satisfy all your desires, because that's not the only thing that is needed. And it's not just being loved; it's learning to love. Why freedom is not what you think it is. The chapter on freedom says that one of the things we say about freedom is that freedom is always the freedom to do what you want, as long as you don't hurt anybody else. And I think that's a rather bad idea. That's a bad understanding of what freedom is. And so what the chapter tries to do is to try to get underneath the surface of that and show why that understanding of freedom is problematic, and why the Christian understanding of freedom is a much healthier and more life-giving version of freedom than that. So I think those are some of the ideas on it.
Thank you.
Another person asked the following. We can see that there are several movements, self-being movements. We could call them like that, self-being movements that are very successful today. Very successful. And could there be probably a kind of envy at the church, or with the church, at the church, because their members aren't growing and others do? Could that be a kind of motivation?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of studies done in the UK and in the States as well that actually say that when people do sociological studies, people who have a belief or a faith in God tend to be happier than people who don't. And that's just an empirical observation. It's not a faith statement. It's something that just comes out of interviews that people have, that faith brings a kind of contentment that you often find that you don't have without it. Now, of course, there are many people who don't have a faith who are quite happy, and many people who are Christians who are not very happy. And in one way, you could say that you don't become a Christian to find happiness, because often, true faithfulness to Christ, the path of Christian faith, doesn't always lead to happiness. It often leads to self-denial and martyrdom, which is not necessarily the same way, but it is in a kind of in a strange roundabout way. I think a means of true happiness. There's a number of books that have been written by theologians like Ellen Shary or Miroslav Volf, which are focused on happiness and how actually Christian faith is a kind of route to happiness. And in fact, Blaise Pascal talks about it quite a bit as well. And he talks about actually in a strange paradoxical way although Christian faith looks like a path of suffering and self-denial, actually it's the one thing that brings you true happiness. And I suppose that's why I guess our contemporary culture says, well, you will become happy if you satisfy all your desires, whether that's for travel or for fame or wealth or popularity or sex or whatever it might be. And I suppose Christian faith says, well, that may bring an immediate kind of pleasure, but actually in the end, what really brings us happiness is to be in healthy relationship with God and our neighbor, which initially doesn't sound the most promising route to happiness, but actually is. And I think that's one of the things we have to rediscover as the Christian church, to portray the Christian faith as the thing that really makes you happy in the end. Although paradoxically so, it gets there in the end, but it's not, even though it doesn't seem like it is actually the route to happiness. And when you think in English, certainly that word happy, it has two meanings historically. It means, I don't know, in German you have glücklich, I suppose. I don't know what that, and it means happy in the sense of joyful, happy, but it means kind of right. It means apt. It means something that is in the right place, that you experience joy from being in the right place in the world. And I think that's the kind of happiness we talk about.
Thank you.
There's been another question on self-improvement. I'd like to combine these questions with a question I had while I was reading the book. Because today we often talk about the danger of constant self-improvement, as you mentioned. And I have a good friend. He's professor of ethics in Berlin, and he told me once, isn't Christianity partly responsible for that? Because the idea that every person should become holy seems to demand a lot of focus on the self, almost a spiritual form of self-optimization. And could there be kind of trueness? No.
Yeah, or like a root of this idea.
Root of this idea, yes.
Yeah, I think there is something in that. John Calvin in his famous Institutes begins with that statement. The true knowledge is knowledge of God and knowledge of yourself. And he says it's hard to know which comes first. Is it you know yourself first and then you know God, or was you know God first and then you know yourself? But his understanding of Christian faith was that true knowledge is knowledge of both yourself and God. And for him, of course, that means knowledge of yourself means knowledge of who you really are, as someone created by God, with all the wonderful things that God has created in you, but also the flaws and the failures and the kind of sinfulness and the brokenness that is in you at the same time. So there is a proper sort of self-knowledge. And I think you're right, the path of holiness is a path of self-improvement. But I think that the difference of it is a path of self-improvement that is always in relation to God and in relation to the neighbor. And so that if you are embarked on the Christian faith, it's not a kind of individualistic path of self-improvement whereby you become better at football, or sort of more physically fit, or more beautiful, or more skilled at the piano, or whatever it might be. It's not that. It's not that those things are bad things, but it's that you become holy in the sense of being more focused upon love of God and love of neighbor, and more capable of those things. Because it says that a spiritually immature person is someone who is simply incapable of loving their neighbor or loving God, because they're so absorbed with themselves that they never think beyond that to the needs of their neighbor. That's a spiritually immature person. And it takes time and prayer and a certain sense of self-examination to learn those skills of loving your neighbor, even loving your enemy, and loving God, to make that turn outwards from the inward turn towards the outward turn. So there is something in that, I think. You're right. There is a kind of self-improvement, but it's a different kind of self-improvement that I think we often think of in our contemporary culture.
Another question that came up in our discussion was the role of maybe gender and sex. And that is something that I was surprised that you did not comment on in your book at all. Like I didn't find this question. And one member of our audience asked whether women might be actually closer to the idea of recognizing God as giving birth to another human being is kind of this, I don't know, I don't know how to call that in English, like the getting rid of this self in giving birth. What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting thought. I remember having conversations with my daughter around this when she started having children. She has 3 boys now, and she was saying that becoming a mother had taught her a great deal about the Christian faith, because you have to be totally, you can't be selfish. You basically have to give your life for these children, and you have to feed them. You have to be aware of them every single moment of the day. You have to take care of them, especially in their early years. And one of the ways in which we learn, the female part of the species, one of the ways in which I think women have the ability to learn is in that. No, it's not. Obviously, not every woman has a child, but it's one of the ways in which we learn to go out of ourselves is having children. And that's true for women, bearing children, and sometimes bearing the immediate responsibility of breastfeeding and so on. But it can also be true for fathers as well. And it seems to me that those of us who have had the privilege of having children as men have, is that understanding of what it means to be a father. We call God Father. And I think I remember realizing at that moment when our first child was born that here was someone in the world that could do nothing for me at all. All he could do was sit there and cry and, wet his nappy and make a noise. I loved him. I would have given anything for him. And I think in that moment, I experienced something of the nature of the love of God that I hadn't ever experienced before. Now, there are other ways that people who don't have children are able to learn the same sort of things. There are many different routes and different ways in which we can encounter and understand more of the love of God. But it seems to me that having children is one of those ways. It's not the only way, but it's one of the primary ways in which we do that. And it's slightly different depending on whether you're a man or a woman. I think one of the other things in gender is that, and I've had conversations with people as a result of this, and it gets back to your question, Johannes, I think about self-hatred. That, and I've often had women coming up to me and saying, well, actually, women are more likely to be self-effacing, and you have to be quite careful of that language, especially with women who maybe have been taught to go into the background and be quiet and to be submissive, and almost to kind of hate themselves in that way. And that's why that language can be quite negative for someone who has a tendency in that direction anyway. Now, I don't know whether that's true, whether that's more likely of women or not, but some people have often pointed that out to me, that may be something. So there are sort of gender differences within that as well, but it's not something I've focused on in the book, but I think it's a good point to make.
And the last question, one person didn't got it right, but you don't think TikTok is quite harmless. You think TikTok could be dangerous?
Well, I suppose I think these smartphones in our pockets are a mixed blessing. I think we have to they can be good. They enable us to connect with one another. Technology enables us to have conversations like this, which we wouldn't have without it. People have always used technology right from the beginning of the human race, when we created spades and shovels and knives and so on. So technology is always there. But of course, technology is only as good as the purposes you use it for. You can take a knife and you can use it to cut your bread, but you can also take a knife and stab somebody in the chest. So the question is, how do we use the technology that we have? And I think part of our problem at the moment is that we have a kind of impulse to use whatever technology we can invent, regardless of what it actually does to us at the end of the day. And I do sometimes fear that the way the algorithm works, if you're not aware of it, it can end up pushing you into corners of culture. Now, we can see that in a number of different ways. It can actually exacerbate your worst characteristics if you're not careful, and therefore we need a kind of healthy distance, a healthy kind of respect for the technology, but also a kind of suspicion of it at the same time. How is this shaping me? And I sometimes wonder about, I get on a bus and I see young people just scrolling through endless videos. That's all they're doing. And they're not talking to anybody else. They may be sitting next to a friend, but they're not talking to the friend. These are addictive. And, the whole reign of reels on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and whatever, they can be harmless, but it's like anything. You have to kind of control the habit. It's like food. It's like drink. It's like, if you don't control your desire for alcohol or for food, you're going to become an alcoholic, or you're going to become obese. Same with social media. Social media is the most addictive thing we have in our culture right now. And so I think we just have to be a little bit cautious about how we use it, and to use our smartphones with a certain degree of realizing how dangerous they can be as well as how useful they can be.
That is a true wisdom, some true wisdom for our audience. Thank you so much for the time you had for the interview. That was wonderful. I learned twice as much as I learned from reading your book, and I feel like we have to do this again on your new book. Let's hope it will be translated into German at some point.
Hope so.
What are you going to write about next?
There was a book on Pascal.
The book on Pascal. Sorry, yes, I forgot. Yes. Yeah.
So it's out already in English.
It's in English, and I think it's going to be translated into one other language. I can't remember what it is. Danish, I think it was. I can't remember. But anyway, it should be. I don't know whether it's going to be translated into German. Hopefully one day, maybe. Yeah.
We will invite you again if that happens.
For sure. Thanks a lot. Mr. Tomlin. Thanks for being here with us. Good night. Best wishes, best greetings to.
Thank you very much. Okay. God bless. Bye-bye.